You think you can sit there with that smug grin, Kimmel, and lecture me about courage? I've stared down worse snakes than you in the desert sun, and I'm not about to take your sanctimonious crap on live TV. Clint Eastwood's gravelly voice thundered across the studio, his eyes narrowing like a gunslinger ready to draw. The audience gasped, their murmurs swallowed by the raw edge of his words. Jimmy Kimmel, perched behind his sleek desk, leaned forward, his smile curling into something sharp and predatory. The air crackled with hostility, a showdown brewing under the hot glare of the cameras. This wasn't just a talk show segment gone wrong. It was a collision of two men, one a legend carved from grit and time, the other a polished host who thrived on poking bears for laughs. Tonight, though, the bear wasn't laughing. The trouble started when Jimmy, ever the provocateur, decided to needle Clint about his latest film, a gritty war drama that had critics buzzing and audiences divided. With a smirk, Jimmy launched into a monologue dripping with sarcasm about how Clint's old-school machismo was out of touch with modern sensibilities. He mocked the film's unapologetic portrayal of sacrifice, calling it a love letter to outdated ideals. The audience tittered nervously, sensing the jab was more than just late-night banter. Clint, seated in the guest chair, his weathered hands gripping the armrests, let Jimmy dig his own grave. The host, emboldened by the crowd's chuckles, pressed harder, questioning Clint's understanding of today's world. "Come on, Clint, don't. You think it's time to hang up the spurs? Maybe let the younger folks tell the stories." The words landed like a slap, and the studio fell silent, waiting for the icon's response. Clint's face hardened, his jaw tightening as if chewing on the insult. He'd come to promote his film, not to be dissected by a man who made his living tossing softballs at celebrities. The audience could feel the shift, like a storm rolling in over the plains. Jimmy, oblivious or maybe just drunk on his own bravado, leaned back and tossed out another barb. "I mean, your characters are always so tough, but what's tough about clinging to the past?" It was a cheap shot, and Clint wasn't having it. He leaned forward, his voice low but piercing, cutting through the studio's hum. "You want to talk tough, Jimmy? Tough is watching men die for something bigger than themselves. Tough is building something that lasts, not tearing it down for a quick laugh." The crowd erupted in applause, but Jimmy's eyes glinted with something darker. He wasn't about to let Clint steal the moment. The argument escalated when Jimmy, doubling down, brought up Clint's age, a topic that had no place in a discussion about art. "You're what, pushing 90? Don't you think it's time to step aside?" The question hung in the air, cruel and unnecessary. Clint's response was a masterclass in controlled fury. He stood towering despite his years and pointed a finger at Jimmy. "You think age is a weakness? It's experience, kid. Something you clearly lack." The audience roared, some cheering, others shouting in shock. Jimmy, caught off guard but too proud to back down, fired back, accusing Clint of being a relic who glorified violence. The exchange was no longer a debate. It was a verbal brawl, each man landing blows that echoed beyond the stage. The producers, sweating in the control booth, debated cutting to commercial, but the cameras kept rolling, capturing every searing word. As the segment teetered on chaos, Clint's patience snapped. He wasn't here to be a punching bag for a host, chasing ratings. Jimmy, sensing he'd pushed too far but unable to resist the spotlight, tried to pivot with a forced laugh, inviting Clint to lighten up. It was the wrong move. Clint's voice dropped to a growl, each word deliberate. "You don't get to tell me how to feel, Kimmel. You don't get to sit there and spit on a lifetime of work because it doesn't fit your little narrative." The audience was on its feet now, some chanting Clint's name, others stunned into silence. Jimmy, his face flushed, tried to regain control, but the moment was slipping away. Clint turned, his boots heavy on the stage floor, and walked off, leaving Jimmy alone under the camera's glare. The host's forced smile couldn't mask the sting of defeat. The studio door slammed behind Clint Eastwood, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the stunned silence. Jimmy Kimmel, still seated at his desk, tried to salvage the moment with a weak chuckle, his eyes darting to the audience for support. "Well, folks, looks like Clint's got a temper to match his movies," he quipped, but the laughter was sparse, uneasy. The crowd, still buzzing from the confrontation, wasn't buying the deflection. Some clapped for Clint's exit, their applause a rebuke to Jimmy's smugness. In the control booth, producers scrambled, barking orders to keep the show on track, but the energy had shifted. Jimmy's usual charm felt hollow, his confidence shaken by the legend who'd just walked out on him. Backstage, Clint's boots clicked on the polished floor, his face a mask of controlled rage as he headed for the exit, ignoring the stagehand's nervous glances. Away from the cameras, Clint's mind churned. He hadn't come here to play the fool for some slick-talking host who thought he could score points by dragging a man's legacy through the mud. Jimmy's attack wasn't just personal. It was an assault on the values Clint's films had championed for decades. Honor, sacrifice, the weight of hard choices. As he passed a row of framed photos from past guests, Clint's thoughts flashed to the soldiers he'd portrayed, men who'd faced real battles, not staged ones for ratings. He'd agreed to this interview to talk about his new film, a story of a Korean War veteran's redemption. But Jimmy had twisted it into a circus, mocking the very grit that defined the project. Clint's hands clenched, his knuckles white. He wasn't done with this fight, not by a long shot. Meanwhile, Jimmy pushed through the next segment, his voice tighter than usual. He cracked jokes about a recent political gaffe, but the audience's response was lukewarm, their minds still on the clash. Behind the scenes, his team was in damage control. A producer whispered that social media was already lighting up with clips of Clint's walkout, fans praising the actor's defiance. Jimmy's ego stung. He wasn't used to being upstaged. Determined to reclaim the narrative, he planned to address the incident in his closing monologue, framing Clint as oversensitive, out of touch. But even as he rehearsed the lines in his head, doubt gnawed at him. Had he gone too far? The audience's loyalty seemed to lean toward Clint, and Jimmy hated losing the crowd. Backstage, a young assistant, barely out of college, caught up with Clint near the exit. "Mr. Eastwood, please, don't leave yet," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "The producers are freaking out. They want to talk." Clint stopped, his piercing gaze softening just a fraction. "Talk's cheap, kid," he said, his tone gruff but not unkind. "Your boss crossed a line, and I don't sit around for disrespect." The assistant, flustered, mentioned that Jimmy might apologize on air if Clint returned. The idea hung in the air, tempting but unlikely. Clint shook his head, his voice low. He doesn't get to fix this with a soundbite? But as he stepped toward the parking lot, a spark of strategy flickered. Walking away was one thing. Letting Jimmy control the story was another. The show cut to commercial, and Jimmy's team huddled, debating how to spin the disaster. A senior producer suggested inviting Clint back for the next segment, offering a chance to clear the air. Jimmy scoffed, his pride bruised. "He's the one who stormed off. Let him stew." But the producer pressed. The audience was turning, and a viral clip of Clint's exit could tank Jimmy's reputation. Reluctantly, Jimmy agreed to a half-hearted gesture, an on-air nod to Clint's contributions, cloaked in humor to save face. As the show resumed, Jimmy leaned into the camera, his smile forced. "Folks, Clint's a legend, no question. Maybe we got a bit heated, but that's live TV, right?" The crowd's response was mixed, some clapping, others murmuring. Clint, now in his car, heard the broadcast through the radio. His grip tightened on the wheel. This wasn't over. Clint Eastwood's car idled in the studio lot, the radio still humming with Jimmy Kimmel's voice, now dripping with faux sincerity as he tried to smooth over the clash. Clint's fingers tapped the steering wheel, his mind racing. He'd walked out to make a point, But Jimmy's attempt to spin the narrative as a misunderstanding stoked his anger anew. The host thought he could talk his way out of this, painting Clint as the hothead while he played the reasonable guy. Clint wasn't about to let that stand. He cut the engine and stepped out, the night air cool against his skin. The fight wasn't just about tonight's show. It was about respect, something Jimmy seemed to think he could toss aside for a cheap laugh. Clint headed back toward the studio, his stride purposeful, ready to confront the host on his own terms. Inside, Jimmy was wrapping up a segment with a B-list comedian, his banter forced as he tried to regain the audience's warmth. The crowd's energy was off, their attention fractured by the earlier fireworks. Whispers rippled through the seats about Clint's walkout, and some audience members checked their phones, where clips of the dispute were already gaining traction online. Jimmy caught a glimpse of a tweet praising Clint's raw honesty and felt a pang of unease. He'd built his career on sharp wit, but tonight he'd miscalculated, underestimating a man who'd faced down critics and wars on screen for decades. As the comedian droned on, Jimmy's eyes flicked to the stage manager, who signaled that Clint had been spotted re-entering the building. His stomach dropped. This wasn't part of the script. Backstage, Clint brushed past security, his presence commanding despite the late hour. A producer, sweating and stammering, tried to intercept him. "Mr. Eastwood, we can work this out. Maybe a quick sit-down with Jimmy?" Clint's gaze was steel. "I'm not here to sit. I'm here to talk." The producer, sensing the storm, led him to a green room, where a monitor showed Jimmy on stage, now pivoting to a monologue about Hollywood's obsession with sequels. The jab was subtle, but pointed. Another dig at Clint's career longevity. Clint's jaw clenched. He didn't need a script to know what he wanted to say. He told the producer to get him a mic and a moment on air. Now. The producer hesitated, then nodded, knowing better than to argue with a man whose resolve was forged in decades of battles. On stage, Jimmy was mid-joke when a stagehand whispered in his ear. His smile faltered just for a second as he processed the news. Clint was back and demanding airtime. The audience, unaware, laughed at his punchline, but Jimmy's mind was elsewhere. He'd planned to end the show with a slick apology, framing himself as the bigger man. Now Clint was forcing his hand. The cameras panned to the crowd, and Jimmy seized the moment, ad-libbing to buy time. "Folks, we might have a surprise. Tonight, stick around, you never know who'll show up." The audience cheered, sensing drama, but Jimmy's heart raced. He didn't know what Clint was planning, and for once, he wasn't in control. Clint stepped onto the stage's edge, mic in hand, his silhouette looming in the shadows. The crowd erupted, recognizing the iconic figure. Jimmy turned, his expression a mix of surprise and dread, as Clint walked into the light. "You got something to say, Kimmel?" Clint's voice was steady, cutting through the noise like a blade. The audience hushed, every eye locked on the two men. Jimmy, scrambling to keep his cool, gestured to the guest chair. "Clint, good to see you back. Let's talk, not fight." But Clint stayed standing, his stance unyielding. "You don't get to set the terms, not after that stunt you pulled." The tension was electric, the studio a powder keg ready to explode. Clint was here to finish what Jimmy started, and no one was looking away. The studio air was thick with anticipation, as Clint Eastwood stood at the edge of the stage, his piercing gaze fixed on Jimmy Kimmel. The host, caught off guard by Clint's return, tried to mask his unease with a tight smile, but his usual swagger was crumbling. The audience, sensing a reckoning, leaned forward, their murmurs fading into a charged silence. Clint's voice, low and deliberate, carried the weight of a man who'd spent a lifetime commanding respect. "You think you can tear down a man's work for a laugh, Kimmel? You think you can mock what you don't understand and call it entertainment?" Each word landed like a hammer, and Jimmy's attempt at a casual shrug only fueled the crowd's growing allegiance to the legend before them. Jimmy, desperate to regain footing, leaned into his mic, his tone sharp but shaky. "Clint, nobody's tearing you down. It's just a show, just talk. You're taking this way too personally." The audience hissed, a few booing softly, their loyalty shifting. Clint didn't flinch, his boots planted firmly as he stepped closer to the desk. "Personal? You made it personal when you dragged my life, my films, into your little game. You don't get to hide behind 'it's just a show' when you're spitting on sacrifice and calling it a joke." The crowd roared, some standing, their applause a wave of support for Clint. Jimmy's face reddened, his fingers gripping the desk as he realized he was losing the room. Backstage, the producers were in a frenzy, torn between letting the clash play out for ratings and fearing a PR disaster. The director hissed into his headset, urging Jimmy to de-escalate, but the host was too deep in his own ego to back down. He leaned forward, his voice rising with a mix of defiance and desperation. "You're acting like I insulted your whole career, Clint. I was just asking questions the audience wants answered." It was a weak defense, and the crowd's groans confirmed it. Clint shook his head, his eyes never leaving Jimmy's. "You weren't asking questions. You were swinging punches and you missed. Badly." The audience erupted again, their cheers a testament to Clint's command of the moment. The confrontation took a sharper turn when Jimmy, stung by the crowd's reaction, made a fatal misstep. "If you can't handle a little heat, maybe you're not as tough as your movies make you out to be." The jab was meant to sting, but it backfired spectacularly. Clint's lips curled into a half-smile, the kind that promised trouble. "Tough's not about running your mouth, Kimmel. It's about standing up when it counts. You wouldn't know the first thing about that." The audience was on its feet now, chanting Clint's name, their energy a tidal wave that left Jimmy floundering. He tried to interject, but Clint cut him off, his voice rising just enough to silence the room. "You want to talk about my films? They're about people who fight for something real, not clowns chasing applause." The stage felt like a battlefield, with Clint holding the high ground and Jimmy scrambling to save face. The host, his composure cracking, gestured wildly to the crowd. "This is my show, Clint. You don't get to come in here and lecture me." But the words sounded hollow, and the audience's boos drowned him out. Clint took a final step forward, his presence towering despite his age. "Your show? You're just renting this stage, kid. Respect's earned, not handed out." With that, he tossed the mic onto the desk, the clatter echoing through the studio. The crowd exploded, their cheers shaking the walls as Clint turned and walked off again, this time with the final word. Jimmy sat frozen, the cameras still rolling, capturing his defeat for the world to see. Clint Eastwood's boots echoed down the studio hallway, each step a declaration of victory as he left the stage behind. The roar of the audience followed him, their cheers a thunderous endorsement of his stand against Jimmy Kimmel's cheap shots. He didn't need to look back to know the host was reeling, his carefully crafted persona unraveling under the weight of a legend's rebuke. Outside, the night air hit Clint like a wave of clarity, the city lights glinting off the pavement as he headed for his car. He'd come to talk about his film, a story of grit and redemption. But instead he'd fought a different battle. One for respect, for the values he'd spent a lifetime defending. And he'd won, not with fists but with words that cut deeper than any punch. Back in the studio, Jimmy sat at his desk, the cameras still rolling as he tried to salvage the final minutes of the show. The audience's energy was electric, their allegiance firmly with Clint, and Jimmy's attempts at humor fell flat. Each joke met with tepid claps or outright silence. He pushed through a closing monologue, his voice strained as he avoided mentioning Clint directly, instead pivoting to a generic quip about passionate guests. But the crowd wasn't buying it. Some shouted Clint's name, others whispered about the clips already spreading online, where fans hailed Eastwood as a hero who'd put the smug host in his place. Jimmy's smile was a mask, his confidence shattered by a man who'd refused to play his game. In the control booth, the producers were in chaos, fielding calls from network executives who'd caught wind of the viral moment. The switchboard lit up with viewers praising Clint's defiance, while others criticized Jimmy for crossing a line. The host's team scrambled to spin the narrative, drafting statements about creative differences and lively debate. But the truth was clear. Jimmy had picked a fight he couldn't win. As the show cut to its final credits, the audience filed out, buzzing with excitement, their conversations dominated by Clint's commanding presence and Jimmy's humiliating misstep. The host lingered at his desk, staring at the empty guest chair, knowing this night would haunt his career. Clint, now driving through the quiet streets, felt a quiet satisfaction settle over him. He'd never been one for talk shows, their artificial banter and staged laughs, but tonight had been different. He'd stood up for something bigger than himself, for the soldiers, the storytellers, the men and women who'd inspired his work. Jimmy's attack had been a challenge not just to Clint, but to the ideals he'd carried through decades of filmmaking. By walking back in and facing the host head-on, Clint had turned the tables, exposing Jimmy's shallowness to a world that valued substance. His phone buzzed with messages from friends and colleagues, all praising his courage. But Clint didn't need their words. He'd done what he always did, stood his ground. By morning, the story was everywhere. News outlets ran headlines about Clint's triumphant return and Jimmy's fall from grace. Fans flooded online forums, sharing clips of the confrontation, each view cementing Clint's legacy as a man who didn't back down. Jimmy, meanwhile, faced a wave of criticism, his reputation bruised by his own arrogance. He issued a tepid apology on the next show, but it was too little, too late. The world had seen him outmatched. For Clint, the victory wasn't in the headlines, but in knowing he'd defended what mattered. As he parked his car and stepped into the dawn, a faint smile crossed his face. He'd faced down a snake and walked away taller, his legacy untarnished, his fire still burning bright.